Dear learners, listeners and viewers, welcome to this session. We are continuing the unit 3. The title is From War to Dialogue, Emerging Approaches to Conflict Resolution. The previous unit we have talked about the conflict resolution and the methods of conflict resolution. We are continuing the lecture on unit 3 here also. Welcome to this session. I am Dr. G. Uma, working as an assistant professor in the School of Gender and Development Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University. This lecture is part of the course BGP 003. Let me start. We talked about the dialogues and other dialogical approach and negotiations in our previous lecture. Let us look into the other alternatives with regard to conflict resolutions. So, apart from negotiation, mediation, reconciliations, are alternative methods of conflict resolution. These are under strategies of so called integrative negotiations or integrative bargaining, departed zero sum thinking with the notion that there may be ways to accommodate both parties' interest in a negotiation. In practice, integrative negotiation often involves adding inducements to bring one or both parties to recalculate interest enough to support an agreement. Although integrative negotiation allows for non-zero-sum outcomes in many applications, it follows the logic of staple interest. One new development is that states and associations of states are no longer the only actors that can use techniques of influence like those of traditional diplomacy. For example, in the 1980s, even before the end of Cold War, transnational corporations pressurized by negative publicity about their investments and even local governments used their economic power to exert pressure against apartheid regime in South Africa. So, another alternative is structural prevention. It typically focuses on the problems of culturally divided states, especially those with weak democratic traditions, deep ethnic divisions and histories of collective violence perpetrated by one group against other or by past governments against civilian populations. Let us see various tools for conflict resolution. Various tools are available for structural preventions like including institutions for transitional justice, truth telling and reconciliation, electoral and constitutional design, autonomy arrangements within federal governance, laws and policies to accommodate linguistic and religious differences, training for law enforcement officials in the following rule of law, institutions assuring civilian control of military organizations and the development and support of institutions of civil society. Such institutions including a free and pluralistic press, a set of NGOs dedicated to their members, common and peaceful purposes, organizations for alternative dispute resolution and the like serve in part as arenas for the integrative negotiations of differences. The third strategy is normative change, defined as developing, institutionalizing formal principles and informal expectations that are intended to create a new context for the management of conflict. Norms may also define responsibilities for states to prevent violent conflict. Although norms were established to manage conflict between states during Cold War, a notable feature of the post-Cold War period is the effort to use international norms to regulate or prevent conflict within states. Now, let us see the trends. There are signs that universal norms, many of which are stated in United Nations Charter and other international documents. You all know about the United Nations Charter. United Nations basically established after the Second World War for initial objective of establishing United Nations is to do the conflict resolutions between any countries or between countries. But later United Nations has expanded its mandatory and it worked on various issues including development issues. So, in the United Nations Charter and other international documents, you must have seen they become embodied informed institutions that can exert influence on states for conflict resolutions. So, there are signs that universal norms, many which are stated in United Nations Charter and other institutional documents, are becoming embodied in firm institutions that can exert influence on states. Continuing dialogue about the tension in international law between the norms of non-interference on the one hand and those human rights and self-determination of people on the other may be leading toward a new international consensus. It is too soon to be sure that increased prominence of these new strategies of international conflict resolution is an enduring feature of a new world system. However, it seems likely that many of the forces that have made these strategies more attractive are themselves enduring. If intrastate conflicts continue to pose serious threats to global security, if non-state interests remain important and if global integration makes foreign policy increasingly difficult to organize exclusively around coherent and unitary notions of national interest, conflict resolution is likely to rely more than in the past on the transnational activities of non-state actors and on techniques that do not depend on traditional definitions of national interest. Nation states are likely to remain important actors in international relations for some time to come. However, the possibility of violent interstate conflict remains a serious concern. But recent events signify a more complex multidimensional arena of international conflict in which both state interest and non-state actors are important parts of the mix. Under such conditions, some recent trends are likely to stabilize. Now, let us look into the conflict resolution and the international community. First, we will start with the United Nations. I have again and again mentioned in this lecture and previous lecture about the United Nations. United Nations, that is the UN and its agencies, remain to the international community's response to conflict. During the Cold War, the overall effectiveness of the UN in settling international disputes was mixed. With the end of the Cold War, it was hoped that the UN would for the first time to be able to take up the role that was intended for it. In practice, the post-Cold War experience too has been mixed with notable success, that is in Namibia, Cambodia, El Salvador and Mozambique. After the post-Cold War, United Nations could be able to successfully address the conflicts and they could be able to resolve the conflicts. But there is a dismal failures also in Somalia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia, Rwanda. In these countries there is an internal conflict, but international agencies like UN could not be able to resolve its conflicts. The vital factor distinguishing success from failure has usually been not so much the UN institutions, but the policies of the major powers on the Security Council and the intractability of the conflict themselves. Where parties have concerted to the UN mandate and have wished to settle and where adequate finances and personnel have been available, orders have been clear chains of command and communication have been straightforward, and the UN has been able to play a remarkable and useful role, but when parties have been unwilling to accept the UN role, the UN has not been able to impose settlements. That is the, again I would like to repeat here. See, when parties have concerted to the UN mandate, so UN can able to involve and they can able to resolve the conflict. And even they want parties, they wish to settle, and where the adequate finances and personnel have been available, orders have been very clear, chains of command and communication have been straightforward, and the UN has been able to play a remarkable and useful role in this situation. But when the parties have been unwilling to accept the UN role, the UN has not able to impose settlements. Like in his agenda for peace, the former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali proposed that the UN should have involved in peacekeeping, peacemaking and peace building from the earliest stage of conflict prevention to the stage of post-conflict reconstruction. Here only in the post-conflict reconstructions, mostly UN organization, they involve in development issues. Now let us look into the regional organizations. These are the second tier of external agents in contemporary conflict resolution. In an effort to shed part of UN's load, Boutros Ghali proposed that regional organizations should take on the primary responsibility for conflict management. The regional organizations have developed widely varying mandates which reflect the very different characteristics and historical experience of states in different regions. For example, each region, like for example, ASEAN, NATO, they have a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there is an South Asian Regional Cooperation, there is a SAARC. So, ASEAN, like that each region, European Union, like each region, they have their own regional organizations. The members of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe have gone farthest in accepting a role for their regional organization in reviewing the human rights and security practices of member states. They have accepted the common set of wide-ranging norms affecting the human dimensions and have created new institutions for conflict management. Within Europe, other regional organizations such as NATO, the Council of Europe and European Union also play significant roles in conflict management. The Organization of African Unity was established in 1963 with the aim of preserving the territorial independence and sovereign equality of the post-colonial African states. The Organization of American States also operates a norm of non-interference in internal affairs. However, the member states undertook to act violations of democracy through the San Diego Commitment in 1991 and have promoted conflict resolution in partnership with the UN. This was from MEAL 1999. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has been concerted to avoid involvement in member states' internal affairs. One of its main functions has been to regulate interstate disputes between members lest they spill over into internal challenge to regimes. The Asian Regional Forum has developed as a means for building consensus over security challenges in the region, and it has been used as an umbrella for track 2 initiatives and cooperations with the UN. So, conflict resolution, as we have seen, apart from UN, we have seen many in regional organizations they have involved, and in the previous lecture we have seen even organizations like International Red Cross Society and NGOs, they are very well involved in the conflict resolution. For conflict resolution, regional organizations have the advantage of closeness to the source of conflict and familiarity with the main actors. Like regional organizations, they know the regional cultural values in that particular region and local conditions. On the other hand, the interest of local actors, and in particular those of regional hegemony, may make regional organization unsuitable for conflict resolution, and in most parts of the world they are chronically short of financial and other resources. Finally, in my previous lecture also I talked about the NGOs. Here also again repeating the role of the NGOs in conflict resolutions. We have seen the conflict resolution by the international organizations like UN, and we have seen the significance of conflict resolutions by the regional organization. Now let us look into the role of NGOs in conflict resolutions. Finally, the gaps in the coverage of internal conflicts by the official arms of the international community have left a space for humanitarian agencies like International Red Cross Society and other non-governmental agencies to play a larger role. Agencies such as the International Committee of the Red Cross have taken on an enhanced profile in internal conflicts. NGOs have also become more important. For example, NGOs with humanitarian conflict resolution missions have good chance to remain prominent players in world politics. Their comparative advantage lies in using conflict resolution tools that do not depend directly on power politics. Although NGOs can facilitate negotiations that trade off interest, states are properly better positioned to do this. NGOs are uniquely able to contribute by deploying the emerging tools of conflict resolution. They have promoted conflict transformation by sponsoring interactive conflict resolution activities, providing training in informal dispute resolution technique, and supporting various institutions of civil society that participate in democratic debate. They have contributed to structural prevention by advising on constitutional design and the rule of law, monitoring elections, and delivering information on other countries' experience with particular structural prevention techniques written by two staff members of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance summarizes knowledge on some constitutional design issues. So, the role of NGOs for structural prevention are sometimes more prominent than the roles of states. TAWE contributed to the development and enforcement of new international norms by promoting monitoring conditions of human rights. They have contributed treatment of minorities and democratic governance, like to conduct the free and fair elections, and by arguing for international organization to use their resources and influence to hold states to universal norms. So, in this conflict resolution, what are the limitations? Let us look into the limitation. It seems that hardly anyone has a bad word to say against dialogue. Nobody will say that dialogue is a bad one. It is a very good one to resolve the conflict. A broad range of political orientations hold out the aim of, like, quote, fostering dialogue, unquote, as a potential resolution to social conflict and as a basis for rational public consideration. A range of academic approaches proclaim the virtues of an interactive engagement of questions and answers in the shared pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Philosophical accounts of dialogue from Plato to the present employ the dialogical form as a literary genre that represents the external expression of an internal dialectical thought process of back and forth ratiocination. Dialogue constitutes a point of opportunity at which these three interests, political, pedagogical and philosophical, come together. It is widely assumed that the aim of teaching with or through dialogue serves democracy, promotes communication across difference, and enables the active co-construction of the new knowledge and understanding. This was quoted by Peter in 2000. Nevertheless, ideal of dialogue has received withering criticism, particularly from post-structural feminist theorists in education and from those for whom difference is a lived experience of marginalization and not just the democratic category of identifications. Basically feminists, they talk about each one of you as in their own lived experiences. So, they get a critique from the feminist also, from post-structural feminist theorists in education and from those for whom difference is the lived experiences. For these critics, dialogue has exerted a kind of hegemonic dominance that belies its emancipator rhetoric, its apparent openness to difference and its stress on equality and reciprocity within the dialogical relation. The way in which dialogue has become almost synonymous with critical pedagogy has tended to submerge the voices and concerns of groups who feel themselves closed out of dialogue or compelled to join it only at the cost of restricting their self-expression into acceptable channels of communication. Finally, the idealized prescript conception of dialogue has abstracted situated historicity of specific practices of communicative engagement from their consequences for people and groups who encounter the invitation to dialogue in difficult circumstances of conflict. So far in my previous and this lecture, we have listened about international community's preference for peaceful methods of conflict resolution and reduction. Since the World War II, the shift has been from war towards dialogue. Dialogue can be directly between conflicting parties through intervention by third parties like international bodies, regional organizations, NGOs, etc. Negotiation, peacekeeping forces, structural prevention, normative changes are also various mechanisms of dialogue. The international community through United States and other bodies is playing an important role to encourage dialogue and prevent war. Of course, dialogue has its own limitations. There are some criticism of dialogue also. Post-structural feminists in particular, dialogue exerts the kind of hegemony in general in view of disastrous efforts of wars and unresolved conflicts taking shape of serious threats to peace. Dialogue needs to be encouraged both at interstate and intrastate levels, and conflicts need to be reduced. Even these cannot be completely resolved. So, these are the references we have taken for this unit and for this lecture. If anybody interested to read further and know further, they can very well refer these books and articles to know further about these topics. Thank you so much for listening this lecture. Hope you understood international conflict and its resolution. Thank you once again. Thank you so much. Let us meet again in another lecture. Thank you.